Psalm 105. We talked last time about God's covenant and the inheritance that he promised and designated for Israel, which was all of the land of Canaan, which is where Israel and Palestine, or people who designate Gaza as Palestine, that's the geographic location. And for people like me, this answers a question of whose land is this? Has someone been, over the last 70 years, has someone been displaced as so that Israel could take this? Or to me, the answer is no. That's Israel. It always has been, and until the end of time, it will be. Okay, verse 12. When they were but few in number, few indeed, and strangers in it, they wandered from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another. And this is a bit of a review, and I'm reviewing what we talked about before of the history of the Jews. They were nomadic until God brought them across the Jordan River and into what was called the Promised Land. In verse 14, he allowed no one to oppress them. For their sake, he rebuked kings. Now, there were nations and kings who they said, no, you can't pass through here. So they went around. And later on, God rebuked. For Israel's sake, he rebuked kings. And in verse 15, do not touch my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm. Okay, we talked about that and how that can be misapplied and misrepresented so that it becomes a license for a leader to be totally insulated and not held accountable, unaccountable, and unresponsible. That's not what he's talking about. The anointed ones these are Israelites. These are Jews. This is not some pastor of I used to say this is not a pastor of some megachurch, but I have encountered pastors of small churches who convey the idea, I am God's designated leader here. It makes me the anointed one. It makes me the prophet of this congregation. Do not touch my anointed ones. In other words, no accountability. And that is not at all what God had in mind, and certainly not what the psalmist is referencing. Verse 16, he called down famine on the land and destroyed all the supplies of food. And in the book of Genesis, this story is told. He sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. I think I've told you about this before, that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, who were very jealous and very angry with him. And let's be honest, Joseph lacked a little, at this point in his life, when his brothers took their revenge on him, he lacked considerable emotional intelligence. So he was their father's, Jacob's, favorite son. He had been gifted with a variegated coat, designating him as the preferred choice one. Cards were stacked against him, but he didn't help himself. Well, Joseph was sold into slavery. In verse 18, they bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in irons. He was, you remember Joseph's story, if you've read Genesis. There's a lot of people stall out in Genesis, early in the book of Genesis, really, where a genealogy is given. And I'll be honest, a lot of those names you can hardly even pronounce, let alone connect them. But when you get past Noah and the ark and the genealogical records, you get into the narrative of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph, and the stories in that narrative are, in my mind, it's a page turner. The narrative is, well, it's engaging and quite interesting, and when you look at the dynamics within that narrative, the dynamics are no different today than they were then. Technology, different. Human dynamics, no difference. Well, one of the things that happened is Joseph was then resold in Egypt to a guy high up in the government named Potiphar. And he showed himself to be such a disciplined and faithful and loyal, we would probably call him an employee, but he was not an employee. He was a slave. But his productivity, his wisdom, his ability took center stage, and Potiphar put him in charge of his entire household. One day, Potiphar's wife, who I don't think she gets enough blame. I know that's an awful thing to say, but really, she had the hots for Joseph. And the writer of Genesis says, but he was a very handsome young man. We don't know, but I get the sense, there's at least an implication there, that Potiphar had maybe passed his prime. At least with her, he had, because she was so attracted. And this was not just an emotional attraction. She wanted to have sex with him. She lured him into her bedroom, dismissing all the other servants and slaves, and tried to seduce him. And when he realized what was happening, what he said was, I can't sin against God and my master. And he fled. She grabbed his coat, his tunic, and he just ran clear out of it and ran away. Well, she was unhappy that she had been jilted in this way. And when Potiphar came home, she manufactured the concept, the story, that Joseph had come in and tried to rape her, and when she struggled with him, and he left his coat behind. It's an absolute fabrication, but Potiphar didn't know. And he took her word. Joseph was arrested and imprisoned, which is an interesting dynamic in the story, because Potiphar was we would call him the warden of the prison. Joseph, I think through the mercy of God and somehow the mercy of Potiphar, Joseph could have been executed for what Potiphar's wife had said he had done, but he wasn't. He was merely imprisoned. Well, while in prison, two of Pharaoh's servants joined him in prison, his cupbearer and his baker. They both had dreams, and they took their dreams to Joseph. The baker had a dream that he had a basket full of pastries on his head, but the birds came and began taking the pastries out. The cupbearer had a dream that the grapes were crushed into the cup. And so what did these dreams mean? Now today, for most people, including me, when I have weird dreams, I just think a couple of things. What did I eat for supper? And man, my subconscious is really doing the defrag thing here. But in Joseph's day, dreams were considered to have meaning, and these two dreams did have meaning. Unfortunate for the baker, he was going to be executed. The cupbearer, he would be reinstated, and that was Joseph's prediction, and that's what happened. And then as the cupbearer was being released from prison, Joseph said, "Remember me and make a case for me for Pharaoh." The cupbearer said, I would never forget you, and then promptly forgot him for years until the king had a dream about cows, and then another dream about heads of wheat. He couldn't figure it out. None of his enchanters could figure it out. And then the cupbearer said, I have forgotten. I know a man who can interpret dreams. He's in your prison. Went and got him, and you probably remember, Joseph said, well, okay, you're going to have 7 years of prosperity and wonderful crops and 7 years of horrible famine. The Pharaoh was so impressed with this. Verse 19, till what he foretold came to pass, till the word of the Lord proved him true. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. And in fact, he made him, in verse 21, master of his household, ruler over all he possessed, to instruct his princes as he pleased and teach his elders wisdom. Consider this. Because we are in a democratic republic, we're not in a monarchy. Now, some people seem to sometimes act as though that was the case, as though they believed that, but we're not. But in a monarchy, when the king, especially an ancient one as in Egypt, when the Pharaoh puts you in charge of all he had, he was literally the most wealthy individual on the planet. So it's not like, he was worth millions. My goodness, no. This Pharaoh was unspeakably rich, and he put Joseph over all he possessed. And it didn't stop there. He was to instruct his princes as he pleased. In other words, he put Joseph in charge of mentoring and educating Pharaoh's sons. Can you imagine the influence that represented? He was to teach his elders wisdom. I don't know if you've ever tried to teach an elder, but some elders are not real open to being taught. There's a reason why that old proverb, an old dog can't learn new tricks. Okay, well, David proved himself to be so wise that evidently even the elders were willing to learn wisdom from him. So I guess here's the picture. You've got this Joseph guy who was sold into slavery, rose out of that circumstance to become, I think, the second most powerful in all of Egypt. All right, we'll pick it up next time on So Care with Stevie.